This first article is regarding that should states have their own flags, and it's really very important article. So there are three views in this article. The first is saying yes, states should have their own flags, and second is no, states should not have, and third is saying that it's quite complicated. Okay, so let's see the first view, which is saying that yes, states should or can have their own flags, and it would strengthen the federal structure and would serve as a symbol for a more specific identity. So these two keywords we have to remember, that it would strengthen the federal structure and would strengthen, it would serve as a symbol for more specific identity. See, the this he the one who is basically in support of this, he's a former advocate general of Karnataka, and as we know that Karnataka is basically this thinking of designing a flag for the state, and in fact the final design for the flag is being it's been finalized, and the flag is essentially tricolor but having different colors within these. Okay, so the main thing is that do existing laws prevent this? The first question that pops in our mind is that whether the existing laws in the constitution or the statutory laws, they prevent states from having these kind of separate flags. So the answer is no. Now, the explanation is that because under the constitution, the first thing is that under the constitution, a flag is not enumerated in the 7th schedule. And we know that 7th schedule, under 7th schedule, we are having three lists: union list, state list, and the concurrent list. Okay, so if flag is not enumerated in the 7th schedule, that means it's not the domain of anyone. Okay, anyone, by anyone I mean it's not the prerogative of center only. Okay, so however, article 51A, which is article 51A is our fundamental duty, and it says that every citizen shall abide by the constitution and respect its idols and institutions, and the national flag and the national anthem. So article 51A is saying only about that we should respect the national flag and national anthem. It's not saying anything like we cannot have a state flag. Apart from that, there is no other provision regulating hoisting of flags either by the states or by the public, and there is no prohibition under the constitution to hoist any flag other than the national flag. Now, with respect to the national symbols, or with respect to this national flag and emblem, we have two laws. Okay, the first is Emblems and Names Prevention of Improper Use Act 1950, and other is Prevention of Insults to National Honor Act 1971. Okay, so under this in this first act, okay, the prohibition is with respect to only that there should be no use, the use of flag for any trade, business calling or profession, or in the title of any patent, etc. And the second act, which is this Prevention of Insults to National Honor Act 1971, under this there is no prohibition against any state hoisting its own flag. What is prohibited under this act? That the national flag should not be insulted by burning it, mutilating it, or by defacing it. So the argument he's putting is that even the two acts which we are having with respect to the national symbols, national flag and emblem, they also do not prohibit states from having their own flags. Okay, so no prohibitions in law. Then with respect to the national flag, we are having Flag Code of India 2002, and even this law, this code, it does not impose prohibitions on a state flag. Fine. On the okay, and this code authorizes the flying of other flags under the condition that they should not be hoisted from the same masthead as the national flag or placed higher than it. It means what? That even this Flag Code of India is not prohibiting states from hoisting their own flags, and secondly, this code, it allows okay, states that they can hoist their own flags, but under certain conditions, that they should not insult the national flag in any case, and the state flag should not be, I mean, whatever the flag the states or other particular institution is hoisting, they should not be placed higher than the national flag. Okay, so means explicitly these laws and these codes, they are not saying that states can have their own laws, but they're also silent on the issue that states can have their own flags or not. Okay, so implicitly we can derive this idea that this code provides space for a state flag as long as it does not offend the dignity and honor of the national flag. Okay, now the thing is that, see, in India, uh, it's not of that much use, leave that. Okay, next here is the argument given by this person is that having a separate flag is not going to be affront to national integration, that even if states are having their own flags, and it's not going to put national integration at peril. On the contrary, a separate flag for the state would strengthen the federal structure and serve as a symbol for a much more specific identity. So he's saying that if the states are having their own flags, then because the states are diverse on the basis of language, linguistic reorganization is there. Okay, and because of states having separate flags, then they will be having more specific identities, and they'll be more integrated with the Indian Union. Okay, so the argument is this. And apart from that, it's a democratic right for the states to have their own flag, because see, he is quoting the example of US, because we know that in US we are having 50 states, and all these 50 states in US, they have their separate and distinct flags apart from the national flag. Similarly, in UK, the political units, okay, the four political units, that means England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, they have their own flags without offending or affecting the integrity of UK. And so similarly, Karnataka can also have its own flag, or if we don't have to speak in context of Karnataka, then the states can have their own flag, because it would not only strengthen the democracy but federalism of India as well. So this was the point of view that why that yes, states should have their own flags. Now let's look at that why states should not have their own flag. So this Ravi K Mishra, who is the deputy director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, he's saying that no, states should not be given the authority to have the separate flags, because see, I say that the emphasis of the founding fathers was on sustaining and encouraging those markers of diversity that were considered to be in sync with the concept of an organic unity. Fine. So he's saying that our founding fathers, fine, who were all involved in the Constituent Assembly, they already allowed those markers of diversity to sustain. For example, we had linguistic reorganization of states, and apart from that, we are having so many provisions within the constitution to serve the diversity of our country. Already we have given enough scope and provision to serve the diversity of the country, so that one organic unity, I mean the concept of organic unity, can be sustained. Organic unity means that we all have, I mean developed or produced from a single source, and that is India as a nation, and all the states are part of it. Okay, like the different body parts of a single body. So this is the organic unity. So he's saying that this founding fathers have already given enough scope to the different diversities in the constitution. And even if we are saying that the states have been linguistically reorganized, and because states have been linguistically reorganized, and we are having homogeneity within these linguistic boundaries in the state, and so states can have different flags, this view is quite skewed view. Fine, because we are not considering the reality, and the reality is that even linguistic diversity, which eventually emerged as the pivotal marker of delineating internal boundaries, is internally contested. Because see, we are having Marathi speaking areas in Karnataka as well. Fine, this there is a reason in Karnataka around the Belgaon district where the people, they are basically in Karnataka but they are Marathi speaking people. So when you are saying that because there is linguistic homogenization within the Karnataka, and so Karnataka should be allowed to have a state flag of their own, then what about the people who speak Marathi in this area? Because they don't speak Kannada. Fine. So do they represent, I mean, will they accept the state flag of Karnataka as their own? This will be a question. So I mean, he's saying that within these internal boundaries which are created by the linguistic reorganization, within these boundaries also we can see fault lines. Okay, so this is the issue. So it's I mean, it should not be, I mean, it should not be the case that the provision of states having separate flag, you know, it can complicate this entire thing. Okay, so to further complicate this by emphasizing a separate flag for a state, it would open a Pandora of the boxes. Definitely, every state will be having their own flag then. Okay, so it would likely to lead to a demand for sub-regionalism. Okay, and this could weaken the idea of fraternity. Fine. And fraternity का जो idea है, it would be threatened, and we should keep in mind that fraternity is also mentioned in our preamble. Okay, so the very idea of fraternity, and so one can say the very ideas which are mentioned in the preamble, they would be threatened. Fine. And second thing, the point he's saying, the first point he's saying that the idea of this linguistic boundaries is in itself contested, so do not complicate the process because it would lead to sub-regionalism. The first point is this. The second is that India is not a federation, and this is really very a technical point, because see, if we talk about countries like US where we are having around 50 states, okay, so the different states in US, before this formation of United States of America, they were separate entities. They form a consensus, and then they actually come together and form United States of America. Fine, but the case of India is different. Okay, in India we don't say, nowhere in the constitution it's mentioned that India is a federation. In constitution it's mentioned that India is a union of states. Okay, because the condition of India was like that at the time of independence, that different states, they were, you know, on their different paths. Even many of the states, they were to be integrated within India. So it was just to have the administrative convenience that we formed a federation. It was not the case as was in the United States, where different states come together and form a federation. Fine. So this is the difference between other countries where they are having separate flags for their own states and between India. So he's saying that India is not a federation. India's trajectory as a polity is different from that of other countries, in the sense that despite being a federal republic, India was conceived of as a union of states and not as a federation. Okay, and the markers of cultural diversity are already given suitable representation. This is the same point. Okay, so this is the case that India is not a federation technically. Therefore, demand for separate flags is tantamount to tampering with the fundamental values of the republic. Fine. Now, there is a case which is this SR Bomai versus Union of India judgment, which is being basically the proponents of separate flag. They cite this case, okay, to support their argument. So he's saying that this argument, which is being this judgment, which is being cited to make the case for a separate flag for states, it revolved around arbitrary actions of the union against the states. and provided a much needed safeguard to them. So he's saying that this particular judgment is against the arbitrary action of the union against the state, and enough safeguards have been provided in them. This judgment is not particularly talking about that states can have their separate flags or something like this. Fine. So, and if we talk about Jammu and Kashmir, so it's entirely a different, different area. It's an exception. And when there is an exception, you cannot make it a universal rule. Fine. So, those countries with separate political identities like flags, dual citizenship, and state constitutions, they have followed a different trajectory from that of India. Their entire political trajectory was different. Okay, so this I have already told that how in US the different constituents they come together and form federation. So no need to repeat it again. Now, and for a strong center, the third point he's saying that the founding fathers, they were quite conscious of the weaknesses of this model if we are going to follow. Okay, so they were already aware, and that's why they move towards having a strong center, because in India we say that India is federal in structure but unitary in spirit. So they knew, and that's why they have made the center strong. Okay, and apart from that, the partition of 1947, which took place, it also left many of the fault lines within the hearts of our founding fathers. So they thought of making center strong. Fine. So, against this backdrop, the demand to have a separate flag for any state is based on the logic, and whatever the demand for separate flag in the different states, particularly in Karnataka, is taking place, it's just for the vote bank politics, it's just for the electoral incentives rather than a principled and well considered argument. And it not only goes against the constitutional values or vision, but also against the very idea of India. So it's a very I mean say radical statement that it's against the very idea of India. Anyway, but this is his point of view. To some extent, it's true. Now let's see the third argument, which says that this entire process is quite complicated. So he's saying that there are two views going on. The one is that there should be a state's separate flag, and the one which is showing indignation over the idea of states having separate flag. And both the views, they are taking the extreme positions. Okay, so he's saying that underlying this indignation means the anger, which is basically over that state should not have the separate flag. It is a belief that territorial loyalty is a unitary in nature. Actually, the language which is written here, it's quite complicated for me as well. I'm trying to somehow understand it. So the basic idea, he's saying that the people who are basically against the very idea of state having a separate flag is because they think that if the states are having their own identity, then it will erode other territorial identities, particularly those built around nation. Means that if states are having their own flag or such identities, then they would not be showing the kind of nationalism they would have shown if they would not be having a separate flag. Okay, so that's why the very idea of nationalism would be, and the very idea of nation would be threatened. Fine. So such nationalism necessarily sees regionalism as a threat, as especially when it goes so far as to claim a flag of its own. For those who consider regionalism as a threat, so this the idea of state having a flag, when a state is claiming its own flag, it's it's beyond the boundary. It will hamper the nationalism. Fine. So the underlying indignation is evolving around this fact that this idea would be against the nation and the nationalism. But he's saying that this meaning of nationalism is very skewed, and it has contradictions, because the proponents who are saying that states should not have their own flag, They think that whatever the majority will determine about nationalism, or whatever the idea of nationalism is for the majority of the people, that should be followed by the minorities, and minorities should be loyal to it. But this should not be there, because we see that the this is quoting example, that we can see that even in US, Indian diaspora is investing in schemes which are promoted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. They are investing and they are sending money for those kind of schemes where where India has to work on. Fine. And one day they are investing money in India, but on the other day they are seeking US citizenship there also, green cards and all these things. Fine. So the thing, but what he's trying to say is that because they are US citizens, but then also they are giving money in India. They, and if suppose there is a match going on, they cheer for Indian cricket team. So does this dilute the idea of their nationalism? Fine. So this is the question. So similarly, if a state is having its own flag, or if a state is, trying to recognize more its own identities, then it is not going to dilute the idea of their nationalism with respect to India. Fine. So, at the heart of this understanding is the idea that nationalism requires individuals to look beyond their immediate self interest to the interest of the nation. And he's saying, see, for an individual, he or she may be having different loyalties to its immediate, surroundings. But the very important idea of nationalism is that whenever the nation calls you, the nationalism for that should be on the upper hand. Fine. Leaving behind all your surroundings, leaving behind all your individual self-interest, all your individual identities. Fine. Apart from that, so he's saying when this is the idea, then a flag for a state is then a step towards building nationalism and not one away from it, and so it would strengthen the very idea of nationalism. And there is absolutely no contradictions between fans the cheering the Karnataka cricket team one day and the Indian team the next day. So the he so basically he is saying that he is in the support of the view that states can have their own state flags, but he's saying the challenge is not to cut other identities, but to help and create a hierarchy of loyalties that help strengthen the Indian nation. What he's trying to say is that in India we do not have to, create a homogeneous entity. We do not have to cut down the other identities. Rather, we have to create a hierarchy of loyalties. Fine. Where at the very below level we can have the smaller regional flags. Fine. Then we can have the state flag, and at the very above we can have the this national flag. And in the case of Karnataka, the Karnataka flag would have to recognize not just the dominant Kannada identity, but also the other smaller identities, the identities of the minorities within the state. They should also have to be identified. Fine. So this should be the condition for a state to have a national flag. Fine. So this was the whole idea of this debate, that whether states should have national flag or separate state flag or not.